Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into some really powerful source material today. It's a collection of articles, research, personal accounts, and they lay out a reality that honestly many of us might find pretty surprising.
Hmm.
It's this idea that pursuing significant goals, especially what these sources call kingdom movements, well, it often comes with significant difficulty, even, intense opposition. It's not always the smooth path we might imagine.
That's really the kind of uncomfortable truth presented right up front in these materials, isn't it? They don't
Yeah.
really shy away from suggesting that difficulty isn't some kind of anomaly in this work. It's frequently just part of the landscape.
Exactly. So this deep dive is all about exploring that courageous leadership sacrifice, specifically in the context of, well, advancing faith and these kingdom movements, which the sources describe often involving things like disciple-making movements or DMMs, these rapidly multiplying
Right,
groups.
rapidly multiplying groups of disciples and churches. And we've got this stack of shared materials here, all focused very intensely on this specific theme.
Yeah. And our mission really is to dig into the core insights these sources offer.
Yeah.
We want to understand the challenges, often unexpected ones, faced by people dedicated to this work.
And explore why, according to the sources, courageous sacrifice isn't just, common, but actually essential. Why does this opposition even happen? How do people persevere?
And maybe crucially, what purpose did these sources actually ascribe to suffering in this whole process?
Yeah, let's jump right in then, because the sources, they start by laying a foundation going right back to a core biblical concept. It's from the New Testament, Jesus sending his followers out.
And right from that very first commission, there's this pretty stark image.
Right. The materials really highlight Jesus' own words. It's Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, saying, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves." I mean,
Uh,
that's not exactly painting a picture of ministry as, like, comfortable or particularly safe, is it?
Not at all. And it gets more specific, doesn't it? The sources explain that this initial instruction from Jesus, it came with clear, direct warnings about what his followers should expect.
Yeah, things like persecution, rejection.
Even opposition from their own families. The sources point to various verses there in Matthew 10, basically from verse 16 all the way through to 39.
And this really sets the tone, doesn't it? It introduces this idea that following Jesus involves taking up one's cross, that symbol of ultimate sacrifice.
And then there's that really powerful, kind of counterintuitive statement from Matthew 10.39, "He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it."
It directly links finding your truest life, your real life, to the act of losing it for his sake. It's profound.
That idea alone is pretty radical to start with, and the sources, they take this radical idea and tie it directly to the kind of work they're discussing. They make this really strong, almost jarring statement. They say it flat out.
Yeah.
There are no disciple-making movements without courageous leaders.
Wow. So it's presented not just as like a desirable trait, but as a non-negotiable requirement for these movements to even happen and keep going, according to these materials.
Which brings us right to what the sources call the unavoidable reality: opposition and persecution. It's not treated as a maybe, is it?
Yeah.
It's framed almost like a certainty.
That's right. The sources explicitly state that kingdom advances create opposition and persecution. It seems like making progress on this front just inevitably stirs things up.
There's a quote in the material from someone named Hassan that really captures this dynamic. He says, "When God's people make disciples and advance his kingdom, the old devil is not happy.
Mm.
If we are doing the king's business, we are going to be in a battle." It really sets the stage for understanding the kind of spiritual intensity behind the resistance.
And we see concrete examples of this in the material. There's Jerry reflecting on ministry in Africa. He noted that while, initial DMM success there involved what he called moderate persecution, everything escalated dramatically around 2008. This was particularly in Muslim regions as significant numbers of people began converting to Christianity.
And this escalation, according to the sources, was swift and incredibly costly. They described the shock of the first Muslim background martyrs in 2 countries, appearing in 2009.
Yeah, and that was followed by long imprisonments for others. Tragically, within just 2 years, in one African country involved in these movements, the sources report more than 200 martyrs.
200. And some of them, I think the sources said, had only been followers for a few days.
Exactly. Just days. But what's really compelling in these accounts is the response of the local leaders and ministries there in Africa. Faced with this just extreme costs.
Instead of pulling back.
Right. They courageously doubled down on disciple makers deployed to many more Muslim regions. The sources suggest that the courage of those who suffered directly actually reinforced the resolve of others who remained.
But the opposition wasn't always, external or violent like that. The sources mention other challenging forms that popped up around the same time.
Like what?
Well, things like bizarre, seemingly inexplicable family health issues hitting the teams. Also, increased theological pushback against the whole methodology of empowering ordinary people to make disciples.
Ah, okay. So resistance from maybe more established structures.
Exactly. And maybe most painfully, disapproval, rejection, being ostracized, even slandered, but from within the Christian community back home or in other areas.
Yes, that internal resistance. That's described as a particularly striking and, frankly, difficult form of opposition in these materials.
It really is. And the sources, they don't just give us statistics or types of opposition. They share these powerful, specific stories that highlight this extreme cost and, well, the profound courage required.
There's one particularly memorable account involving Jerry and a Western colleague. They were planning a covert DMM training, in a high-risk, restricted area. Jerry apparently expressed concern for his colleague's safety, given the risks.
Understandable.
And the colleague's response, it's incredibly moving. With a calm smile, he apparently said, "You see, we died before we got here." He explained that years before, he and his wife had just made this decision of full commitment, accepting whatever cost might come. And then, well, the sources share the heartbreaking reality. This brother was martyred just days later.
Oh my goodness. Days later.
Yeah, and there are more recent accounts shared by the New Generation Global team in the sources that are just as intense. One senior leader was brutally attacked with a machete, left for dead with severe wounds to his head and neck, but was miraculously found alive.
Incredible.
And another, a former Muslim sheikh and well-respected scholar, he was arrested by militants and given an ultimatum: recant his faith within days or face execution.
These are literally life and death situations. And the sources share how these specific terrifying events unfolded, often attributing the outcome to prayer and, well, divine intervention.
Right. For the injured leader, an emergency donor gift came through, providing the critical medical care needed for survival. For the former sheikh, his captors suddenly suffered a brain hemorrhage, creating chaos, which allowed the scholar to just walk away unharmed.
Amazing. But while those specific accounts have these elements of, miraculous preservation, the sources also really underscore the immense tangible loss faced by so many.
Absolutely. One contributor recounts the just devastating experience of watching 11 of his disciples in 4 different countries die in the same calendar year.
11 disciples gone in just 1 year. That's an unbelievable weight to carry.
And there's another story in the sources about someone who was almost broken by the martyrdom of his first 6 disciples. The sources acknowledge the deep pain this caused, but they also state that God redeemed that suffering for his glory.
So these aren't just abstract concepts. They represent real lives, real relationships, and immense sacrifice. The materials emphasize this isn't just about, passively enduring bad news. They argue that great power and purpose are released when God's people are resolute in his service, even when facing these kinds of costs.
And this understanding of purpose and suffering leads the sources to ground this whole reality in biblical examples and perspectives.
Exactly. The sources point directly to Jesus himself as the ultimate suffering servant, referencing passages like Isaiah 52 and 53. He didn't just tell his followers to expect persecution. He walked that path himself, suffering for righteousness' sake.
And they connect this back to that profound prayer Jesus taught and, prayed himself, "Your will be done." They note that for Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying that Luke 22.42, it meant embracing sacrifice, suffering, and ultimately death.
So the question the sources implicitly pose is, when we pray that same prayer, "Your will be done," do we often expect a less costly outcome than Jesus himself experienced?
That's a challenging thought. And the Apostle Paul is presented in these materials as sort of an ideal servant. His life wasn't just characterized by remarkable energy and travel, but equally by constant hardship, sufferings, and persecution.
And the sources include that extensive, almost overwhelming list Paul gives in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 27. It details what he went through: abundant labors, excessive beatings, frequent imprisonments, facing death repeatedly.
Yeah, beatings with rods, stoning, shipwrecks.
Constant peril from all sorts of sources: rivers, robbers, his own people, Gentiles in the city, in the wilderness, at sea, from false believers.
Enduring weariness, toil, sleepless nights, hunger, thirst, frequent fastings, cold, lack of clothing. I mean, it's just an absolutely brutal list when you read it all together.
Yet the sources really highlight Paul's remarkably positive attitude through all of it. He didn't see these difficulties as like roadblocks or signs he was failing. He embraced them as coming with the territory.
Right. He could even say he rejoiced in his sufferings, referencing Colossians 1.24, seeing them as necessary because, as he stated in Acts 14.22, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God.
And this mindset, it echoes Jesus' own warnings, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially during the upper room discourse, recorded in John chapters 15 and 16.
Exactly. He told his disciples point blank the world would hate them because it had hated him first. And startlingly, that people would even think they were doing God a service by killing them.
Which is just chilling. And the sources pull out a stark, universal warning from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. And the word everyone is key here, isn't it?
Yes. Everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. It's not presented as a possibility or something just for a select few leaders, but a certainty for everyone who desires to live that way.
So this brings us to a core concept explored in the materials.
Yeah.
This idea of normalizing persecution. How do people not just survive that, but actually live with that kind of constant expectation?
Well, there's a really powerful illustration that comes from Nick Ripkin's stories. He interviewed Christians in Russia and Ukraine who had endured just horrific suffering. And when he asked them why they didn't make a bigger deal out of documenting these, extraordinary experiences,
Yeah.
an old pastor's response was incredibly simple and profound. He said, for us, persecution is like the sun coming up in the east. It happens all the time. It's the way things are.
Wow. Just normal. Nothing unusual, unexpected, or extraordinary about it for them.
Exactly. It was just the reality of their lives. And Michael Hope, another leader quoted in the sources, he offers some crucial insights into the purpose of this suffering, which kind of shifts the perspective entirely.
So?
He contrasts Satan's only purpose for suffering, which he says is basically to silence believers, a purpose that's only achieved if we respond in fear with God's many transformative purposes.
Okay, so what are some of those divine purposes for suffering, according to the sources? What does God do with it?
Well, drawing from passages like 1 Corinthians 1 and 1 Peter 4, the sources list several things. Suffering is used for shaping godly character,
Okay.
for increasing our dependence on God, for refining, improving the genuineness of our faith,
Makes sense.
for equipping us to minister to others who are suffering, and ultimately for the glory of God.
So from that perspective, suffering isn't just random pain or, a sign that something's gone wrong. It actually has profound potential purpose and even productive outcomes.
Right. And the sources argue that because of this, we actually do new followers, new disciples, a great disservice if we don't make very clear that suffering is normal and expected, and that significant, even great results can come through it.
That's a powerful point. It changes how you might prepare someone for this journey.
Absolutely. Michael Hope shares a personal experience that really illustrates this shift in perspective and dependence. He'd lost contact with a team he was coaching in a dangerous area and was just consumed with worry.
Understandable.
And he describes God speaking to him, saying something like, "Don't worry, they're mine. I've got this. You didn't call them, I called them.
Wow.
If I want them to suffer, they will. If I want them to succeed, they will. You're wrong to be worrying about them."
That must have been incredibly freeing, but also really sobering, realizing that ultimate responsibility wasn't his.
Exactly. The sources suggest this experience prepared him to bear the weight of future losses, like those 11 disciples who died in that one year. It shifted his whole understanding of responsibility.
And this speaks to what the sources call a kingdom mentality. The reaction isn't supposed to be, oh no, I'm suffering, something's wrong, but rather a transformed posture, right?
Yes, more like, okay, what is God teaching me through this? Now I need to make sure that I live that out and that I'm sharing those lessons with others. It becomes this continuous cycle. Hear from God, do what he leads, share the experience, share the lessons learned.
And Steve Smith's accounts in the sources, they show how this normalization, even this embrace of suffering, happens within these rapidly growing movements. Quite striking.
How so?
He describes these gatherings where disciples, maybe in their debriefing time, will literally ask if anyone got any owies following Jesus.
Owies, like injuries.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And when people say yes, maybe they were ridiculed by family, maybe kicked out of their village, they apparently high-five each other and praise their master.
Seriously. High five.
That's what the sources say. They're actively internalizing the promises from passages like Matthew 5, verses 11 and 12, about rejoicing when persecuted because their reward is great in heaven.
That's an incredible image. It's like
Yeah.
consciously living out the Beatitudes. Not seeking suffering, obviously, but celebrating God's presence and strength in it, and looking towards that future reward.
This mindset shift is just so powerful.
Mm.
And the sources share this profound story about how this understanding is intentionally embedded early on, right from the beginning of the discipleship process.
Yeah.
Traditionally, you might ask certain questions at baptism. Steve Smith mentions maybe recommending 3 standard ones. But in one rapidly growing movement, an old man proposed adding a 4th question.
A 4th baptism question. What was it?
And this 4th question, it cuts right to the core of the expected cost.
Yeah.
He proposed asking people, right there at their baptism, when they come into your house, drag you away, throw you in prison, and threaten to kill you, will you still follow Jesus?
Wow. Asking that question at baptism.
Can you imagine? The sources describe Steve Smith weeping when he heard it, just realizing the depth of understanding these new believers had. They truly grasped the potential cost and, as he put it, were joyfully at baptism dying.
It's described as a confirmation, right? A confirmation of death to Christ at baptism, a declaration of allegiance no matter the cost.
Exactly. And the sources suggest this kind of upfront understanding actually breaks the back of the paralysis that comes from fear of persecution. They argue that the fear of persecution is often more debilitating than the persecution itself.
That makes sense. The anticipation can be crippling.
And they include this incredible example of God's active presence within that suffering. There's a story of a brother in prison being interrogated, beaten.
Okay.
A policeman hits him with an electric baton, but the baton malfunctions and breaks. The brother, stunned, actually says out loud, "Wow, I think God is with me."
In that moment.
Yeah. And when the furious policeman then hits him again, this time with his fist, and injures his own arm in the process, the brother just repeats, "Wow, God's with me."
That's an amazing testament to God's presence and power, even in the midst of that kind of brutality.
Absolutely. And the sources emphasize that when these men and women share testimonies, like the testimonies of God's faithfulness in suffering with each other, it emboldens everyone else.
You can see how it would. It builds collective courage.
Of course, all of this comes with significant personal cost, and the sources make it really clear this cost often extends deeply into families as well. They share the story of David and Jan Watson.
Ah, yes, the Watsons. Their story is quite something. They accepted a call to serve among the unreached. Their journey started, I think, in Malaysia.
That's right. And their efforts there led to David being jailed, and eventually the whole family was deported.
But they didn't give up, did they?
Not at all. Undeterred, they specifically asked to be sent somewhere basically no one else wanted to go, which led them to northern India, a real heartland of Hinduism.
And this meant David was often gone for long stretches, frequently in dangerous situations. I think there was a time he was shot at with an arrow.
Yes, shot at with an arrow, thankfully wasn't seriously wounded. But imagine being Gan back home. She shares the profound pain of this sacrifice, missing the everyday joys of family life, sitting alone in church week after week, her tears just flowing freely.
That's heartbreaking.
But she describes this moment where she felt God speak to her, assuring her that her tears, David's absence, their separation, that was her gift to the kingdom, that her investment was deeply valuable in God's eyes.
What a perspective shift.
And adding to that external danger and the strain on the family, they faced incredibly painful ostracism and rejection, but from their own Christian community back home.
Yes, that part of their story is shocking, being called heretics, being told they weren't really Christian.
And perhaps most unbelievably, David's mission agency actually terminated him. Ironically, the sources point out, this happened in the same year that 10,000 churches were birthed in their movement among Hindus in India.
That timing is just staggering. Such rejection from the very people you'd think would be your closest spiritual allies.
But Jan's reflection on their whole journey is incredibly powerful. She says, looking back, they never found us give up anything in the service of the kingdom that God did not give back to us multiple times.
Wow. Despite everything.
Despite everything. And the sources use this and other examples to really underscore what they call that uncomfortable truth.
Yeah.
There is always a price to pay to advance the kingdom, and sometimes that price is severe.
And they connect this back to what they describe as the great mystery of Christianity, this idea of the redemptive nature of suffering.
Right. Just as God used Jesus' suffering and death on the cross to build his kingdom, the sources argue, He uses the suffering and martyrdom of his people for that same redemptive purpose. It echoes Tertullian's famous quote mentioned in the material. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
It's a profound and honestly challenging concept, but one that the sources really assert is absolutely central to the expansion and growth of these kinds of faith movements.
Which makes perseverance absolutely non-negotiable, doesn't it? The sources stress its vital importance because, as they put it, the challenge never lets up. They cite Galatians 6.9, encouraging us not to grow weary in doing good.
And this requires a daily, almost moment-by-moment dependence on God. It's described with a simple but really powerful rhythm in the sources. Breathe in, breathe out, hear from God, do it, and share it.
Breathe in, breathe out, hear from God, do it and share it. It's about constantly being filled and guided by the Spirit just to be able to endure and continue day after day.
And despite the immense cost, the hardship we've been talking about, the sources repeatedly return to this sense of profound privilege felt by the men and women interviewed.
Yeah, that comes through so strongly. They felt blessed beyond measure just to see God at work in such powerful ways, to experience what Jesus said many prophets and kings longed to see but didn't get to see. That's Luke 10:23.
Jan Watson's final words, as shared in the sources, really encapsulate this perspective beautifully, I think. She says she feels blessed beyond measure to just be part of it and see what a great God we have.
A God far bigger than we ever imagined, with a plan far greater than we could ever imagine.
And she ends with this deeply poignant prayer. She expresses her desire for Jesus to return soon, but then immediately adds, "Not yet."
Why not yet?
Because, she says, there are so many who do not know him.
Wow. Holding that powerful tension, that longing for ultimate redemption, yet still driven by this urgent desire for the work to continue, even with all the personal cost involved.
Exactly. It's quite something.
So, wrapping up this deep dive into these sources, the key takeaways are pretty powerful, wouldn't you say? Courage and sacrifice, they aren't presented as optional extras. They're seen as inseparable from advancing faith in these kingdom movements.
Right. And opposition isn't necessarily a sign of failure. It's often framed as an expected, even normalized part of the journey. And crucially, according to these materials, God actually uses that very opposition and suffering for his purposes and for the growth and character formation of the people involved.
And through it all, perseverance anchored in that daily dependence on God is just absolutely key.
The contrast is really stark when you lay it all out, isn't it?
Yeah.
The severity of the opposition and sacrifice described in these accounts set right against the palpable joy, the deep sense of purpose, and that profound sense of privilege felt by those who endured it, as shared in the sources.
It really is. And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting and maybe something for you listening to consider. If opposition, difficulty, or significant personal cost are presented in these sources as expected, even normal, parts of living a life fully aligned with what they describe as God's will and advancing his kingdom, how does that challenge our own expectations? Our understanding of what faithfulness and success really look like? What might it mean for you to look at difficulty, not just as something to be avoided or fixed, but as a potential space where real growth happens and where God might be specifically at work?
That's a powerful question to leave people with. It really turns some common assumptions on their head.